On a warm August morning in 1986, in the quiet town of Williamson County, Texas, the world of one family was shattered forever. Christine Morton, a young mother with a gentle smile and a heart devoted to her little boy, was found brutally murdered in her own home. Her husband, Michael, a devoted father who had kissed his wife goodbye that very morning, returned to a nightmare no man could imagine. But instead of finding justice, Michael found himself accused of the unthinkable. A husband, a father, suddenly painted as a monster. And with no physical evidence linking him to the crime, only whispers, assumptions, and the iron grip of a prosecutor's narrative, Michael Morton was condemned. For nearly 25 years, he sat behind bars, branded a murderer, while his son grew up without him, and the truth lay buried, waiting to be unearthed. But what if the truth was never as simple as it seemed? What if the real killer was out there all along, walking free, hidden in plain sight, while Michael lost everything? Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more wrongful conviction true crime stories. Because this investigation is just getting started, and you won't want to miss how the pieces finally come together after decades of silence, heartbreak, and a relentless search for justice. This is the Michael Morton story. It began like any other day in Williamson County, Texas. The sun had not yet risen when Michael Morton, a 32-year-old grocery store manager, quietly slipped out of his home on August 13, 1986. He kissed his wife Christine goodbye as she lay in bed, still half asleep. Their little boy, Eric, just 3 years old, was safely tucked into his room, dreaming peacefully. Michael had a long day ahead of him at the local Safeway where he worked. For the Mortons, life seemed stable, ordinary, even. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. Michael worked hard, Christine cared for their son, and together they were building the kind of quiet, suburban life many families longed for. But what no one could have predicted was that before the day was over, the life Michael knew, the life Christine had so carefully built, would be shattered forever. Michael left the house around 5:30 a.m., driving to his job in Austin. He'd later tell police he remembered Christine mumbling something when he left, something about his birthday present. It was, after all, the day after his 32nd birthday. He didn't think much of it. At the store, he threw himself into work, checking schedules, stocking, and preparing for a normal shift. To him, August 13th was just another day. By mid-morning, however, everything changed. At 9:30 a.m., Michael received a call at work. His neighbor had come over, concerned that Christine hadn't answered the phone. She had walked into the Morton home and seen something horrifying: Christine's body, lying in bed, covered in blood. Michael's first reaction was disbelief. He told police later, "It didn't seem real. I thought maybe they had it wrong. Maybe they were talking about someone else." But the truth was undeniable. Christine Morton, 31 years old, devoted wife and mother, had been brutally beaten to death in her own bedroom. When Williamson County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found a scene of violence and mystery. Christine's body was on the bed, covered partially with a blue blanket. She had been struck repeatedly in the head with what appeared to be a blunt object. Blood stained the sheets, the pillow, the walls. But something was strange. There were no signs of forced entry. Christine's purse was missing, as were some personal items suggesting robbery. Yet other valuables, including jewelry, were left untouched. And then there was Eric. The Mortons' 3-year-old son was found outside in the backyard, wandering in confusion. He was unharmed. Some neighbors later said they had seen him in the yard earlier that morning, long before police arrived, almost as if someone had let him out. Who killed Christine Morton? That was the question on everyone's mind. To the sheriff's department, the answer came quickly, and tragically, they looked at Michael. Michael was brought home from work by police. He arrived to flashing lights, a cordoned-off yard, and the sight of investigators moving in and out of his home. At first, Officers treated him as what he was, a husband who had just lost his wife in a horrific murder. Michael was in shock. He cried, asked questions, tried to piece together what had happened. His first thought was of Eric. Was his son safe? But within hours, the tone shifted. Detectives began zeroing in on him. They asked detailed questions about his marriage, about Christine, about his work schedule, about his sex life. They wanted to know if the marriage had been strained, if there had been arguments. Michael admitted that they'd argued the night before his birthday. Christine had been upset when he fell asleep during an intimate moment, exhausted from work. Michael thought little of it. To him, it was just the kind of ordinary marital spat couples have and then forget. But to police, this was motive. A husband angry at his wife. A fight that turned deadly. A cover-up. Investigators found it suspicious that Michael went to work so early, leaving before sunrise. They found it suspicious that Christine had been beaten in bed while Michael was supposedly gone. They found it suspicious that there were no signs of forced entry. Within days, their suspicion hardened into certainty. Michael Morton became their prime suspect. But here's the part that still haunts this story. Evidence existed, right from the beginning, that pointed away from Michael. Christine's purse had been found in a wooded area nearby. A bloody bandana was recovered not far from the Morton home. Neighbors reported seeing a suspicious man parking a green van near the house. And most chilling of all, little Eric told his grandmother that a monster had hurt his mommy and that his daddy was not home when it happened. These were all signs that Christine's killer was an intruder. But Williamson County investigators chose to ignore them. In the weeks following the murder, Michael's life spiraled. Christine's family, grieving, desperate for answers, began to doubt him. Rumors spread. The media hinted that maybe the perfect marriage hadn't been so perfect after all. Michael, bewildered, tried to cooperate. He sat for interviews, answered detectives' questions, even waived his right to remain silent. He believed the truth would protect him, but the truth wasn't enough. By September, barely a month after the murder, Williamson County prosecutors indicted Michael Morton for the murder of his wife. The community was stunned. Some couldn't believe it. Michael, the quiet, hard-working husband, accused of bludgeoning Christine to death in their own bed, but others accepted the official story. Husbands kill their wives all the time, don't they? Maybe this was another case of rage, jealousy, or betrayal. The narrative was set. Yet, beneath the surface, things didn't add up. Michael had no history of violence, no criminal record, no known affairs, no financial motive. He adored his son and had worked hard to provide for his family. And there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. But prosecutors had something just as powerful as evidence. They had a story. And in Williamson County, led by the ambitious District Attorney Ken Anderson, stories often carried more weight than facts. Michael Morton, they argued, was a man whose pride had been wounded by rejection on his birthday. In a fit of rage, he picked up a blunt object, perhaps a wooden handle, perhaps something else, and beat his wife to death while their son slept in the next room. Then he left for work, pretending nothing had happened, hoping to cover his tracks. That was the case. That was the story. And as the pre-trial hearings began, Michael realized with growing horror that no one wanted to hear his side. Perhaps the cruelest twist of all was what happened with Eric. After Michael's arrest, Christine's family gained custody of the little boy. Michael, presumed guilty, was cut off. His only child, the one person who could have told the truth about that night, was taken away from him. Michael begged for contact. He wrote letters, pleaded with the courts, prayed for some way to stay connected. But the system saw him as a murderer, not a father. From his jail cell, Michael began the slow, agonizing realization. Not only had he lost his wife, but he might also lose his son. And so, as 1986 turned to 1987, Michael Morton awaited trial. He sat in his cell, grieving, isolated, branded as a killer before he ever saw a jury. He still believed, naively, that the truth would set him free, that the evidence, What little there was would collapse under scrutiny, that his son would speak and justice would prevail. But he didn't yet know the forces aligned against him. He didn't yet know that key evidence was being hidden, suppressed deliberately by prosecutors. He didn't yet know that the bloody bandana, the neighbor's sightings, even his son's testimony would be buried, locked away in files never shown to the defense. And he didn't yet know that the next chapter of his life would not be measured in days or months, but in decades. Michael Morton was about to step into a nightmare that would consume nearly a quarter of a century of his life. And when the jury finally gathered to hear the case of the state of Texas versus Michael Morton, they would be told a story. But it would not be the true story. The gavel's echo had not yet faded when the eyes of Williamson County turned to the man seated at the defense table. Michael Morton, a man who, just days before, had been a grieving husband. Now, suddenly, he was cast as a suspect, a villain, a murderer. How does a husband mourning the brutal loss of his wife become the prime target of justice? That is where our story lingers in Act 2, inside the walls of the courtroom and inside the deeper walls of injustice itself. The district attorney, Ken Anderson, stepped forward with the full confidence of a man who believed the story was already written. His voice rang with certainty. He painted Michael not as a heartbroken man, but as a cold, calculating husband, driven to murder by frustration, by disappointment, by anger over a birthday that did not go his way. The jury listened as Anderson spun a narrative, a domestic dispute turned fatal. He claimed Michael bludgeoned his wife Christine with a wooden object fueled by rage. And then, as if nothing had happened, he supposedly went to work, leaving his little boy alone in the house with his dead mother's body. It was a horrific image, and exactly the one the prosecution wanted to burn into the minds of the jury. But what Anderson left out would later prove far more powerful than anything he put in. You see, by the time Michael's trial began, there were already red flags, signs that this was not the simple domestic killing the prosecution claimed it to be. Neighbors had reported seeing a suspicious man lingering in the area. A green VIN had been spotted near the Mortons' home. And most chillingly, Michael's young son, Eric, had told his grandmother something devastating. Daddy didn't do it. He described a monster, a stranger, a man he had seen the night of the murder. But none of this would ever reach the jury. Why? Because the prosecution withheld it. Evidence that could have raised doubt, evidence that might have shifted the story entirely, was locked away. Michael's attorneys tried to fight back. They argued that the state had no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no blood evidence tying Michael to the crime. They reminded the jury that Michael had been at work when the murder occurred. His time card, coworkers, and even traffic patterns supported his alibi. But Anderson's storytelling was relentless. He framed Michael's normal behavior as suspicious. When Michael didn't break down sobbing on the stand, the prosecution said he was emotionless, proof of guilt. When he tried to remain calm, they said he was cold. In that courtroom, everything Michael did or didn't do was twisted against him. And in a cruel twist of fate, Michael's own personality, his reserved, steady nature, became ammunition for his conviction. Throughout the trial, little Eric, just 3 years old, was kept at the center of Michael's heart. But in court, his voice was silenced. The jury never heard his words, never heard him say that he saw a monster attack his mother, never heard him insist that his father was innocent. Imagine, for a moment, being Michael, sitting there as the state weaves a story about you, knowing that your son holds the truth, and that truth is locked out of the room. The weight of silence pressed harder than the accusations themselves. As the days of testimony drew on, the jury's eyes often fell on Michael. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion. In their minds, they wrestled with the story Anderson had told them and the holes that lingered in the shadows. The defense called witnesses to highlight Michael's devotion to Christine, his love for Eric, his reputation as a hard-working man. But each time, Anderson rose with a counterattack, framing their testimony as bias, as loyalty blinded by love. And then came closing arguments. Anderson thundered to the jury, "This man murdered his wife." He thought he could get away with it. But justice demands that we see the truth. The defense urged them to see the lack of evidence, the unanswered questions. But their voices were quieter, their arguments tangled in the web Anderson had already spun. The courtroom fell silent as the jury left to deliberate. Hours stretched into eternity. Michael sat with his attorneys, his hands clenched, his mind replaying the night Christine was murdered. He had replayed it 1,000 times, searching for answers, for some missed detail that could clear his name. And then, the jury returned. 12 solemn faces. 12 people carrying the weight of a man's fate. The foreman stood, the words heavy in the air. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder." The room gasped. Michael's body went cold. His life shattered in a single word. Christine was gone. His freedom was gone. And worst of all, Eric, his little boy, was taken from him. The judge's gavel came down. Michael Morton was sentenced to life in prison. Life, for a crime he did not commit. He turned to look for his son, for his family, for some sign of hope. But Eric was gone, whisked away, shielded from the chaos. And in that moment, Michael realized he was not just losing his freedom. He was losing his family, his identity, his future. But here is where the story turns darker. For while Michael sat in a cell, the truth sat just outside those prison walls, in police files, in eyewitness statements, in evidence that was buried instead of revealed. And while Michael's world grew smaller, the real killer walked free, unseen, unstopped. And here's the haunting question that lingers at the end of this chapter. If the man convicted was innocent, who was out there, still lurking in the shadows? Prison is not just a place of punishment. It is a place of forgetting. When Michael Morton was locked inside those gray concrete walls in 1987, he entered not just a prison, but a world where time moved differently. Outside, the world continued. His son Eric grew up, friends moved on, technology advanced. But inside, Michael's life slowed to a crawl. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in a cage where he would remain for nearly a quarter of a century. But how does a man who insists on his innocence survive years of wrongful imprisonment? How does he keep faith alive when everyone else believes he is a murderer? This is the story of Michael Morton's lost years. Michael's first nights inside were filled with noise. Steel doors clanging, voices shouting from down the cell block, the constant hum of a world where privacy no longer existed. But beneath the noise was something louder, silence from the outside. Silence from the people he once loved. Silence from Eric. Eric was only 3 years old when his father was taken away. At first, there were visits. A young boy brought in by relatives to see his dad through the glass. Michael pressed his hand against the barrier, trying to make Eric laugh, to remind him that his father was still here. But children grow fast, and children also forget. By the time Eric was 6, the visits had slowed. By the time he was 10, they stopped completely. For Michael, that was the deepest wound. Not the concrete, not the bars, not even the label of murderer, but the quiet absence of his son. Inmates know who's who. They whisper. They trade stories about what others have done. And in a prison system where men are divided by crimes, someone labeled as a wife killer was at the bottom of the moral chain. Michael was instantly branded as a man who had murdered his wife in cold blood while his child was in the next room. To many inside, there was nothing worse. The guards didn't treat him kindly either. They sneered, made comments, and often reminded him, "You're the guy who killed your wife, huh? I hope you rot." But Michael refused to bow his head. He knew the truth. And in a place where survival often meant surrendering to labels, Michael clung to his innocence like a lifeline. Prison has its own rhythm, its own ways of breaking men. Some drown in drugs, some in violence, some in despair. Michael turned inward. He began reading, devouring books, magazines, anything he could get his hands on. He found solace in words, in ideas, in stories of others who had endured suffering and survived. Later, he found faith. Christianity became his anchor. The Bible wasn't just a book, it was survival. Every day, he woke up, made his bed, prayed, and tried to hold on to dignity in a place designed to strip it away. But faith did not erase pain. And at night, when the lights dimmed and the prison fell into uneasy silence, Michael lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the day his life shattered. For years, Michael wrote letters to Eric. Birthdays, Christmas, just because letters. Sometimes they were returned unopened. Sometimes he wasn't even sure if Eric received them. But he wrote anyway. He told Eric stories, shared memories, even gave fatherly advice that a boy should have heard at home, not in scribbles from behind bars. Michael didn't want his son to grow up thinking his father didn't care. But deep down, he feared the truth, that Eric was being raised to believe his father was a monster. And he wasn't wrong. In the late 80s and 90s, while Michael was behind bars, the world changed rapidly. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet was born. Cell phones became part of daily life. But for Michael, years looked the same. The same walls, the same food, the same routine. Inside prison, time stretched like an endless hallway. Outside, Eric became a teenager, then a young man. Michael wasn't there for his son's first baseball game. He wasn't there for birthdays, graduations, or even to give advice during hard years of adolescence. Michael Morton, once a husband, once a father, became a ghost in his own life. Despite his faith, Michael's resolve was tested constantly. He filed appeals. He begged for his case to be reviewed. He asked for evidence to be re-examined, especially the bloody bandana that had been found near his house after Christine's murder. But every request was denied. Every motion rejected. The legal system had closed its doors on him, convinced the right man was already behind bars. Year after year, Michael faced the same devastating reality. The truth didn't matter. Not yet. Not all inmates saw him as the monster the courts described. Some men, over time, came to know Michael as quiet, intelligent, and deeply principled. He tutored others in reading. He helped some study for their GEDs. He offered advice, listened to their struggles, and prayed with those who needed it. But even in friendship, there were lines. Michael never stopped being the wife killer in many eyes. And some wounds inside prison never heal. Perhaps the most haunting part of these years was the distance between Michael and Eric. As Eric grew older, he developed anger, not at the system, but at his father. From Eric's perspective, his dad had killed his mom. That was the story he had been told. And as he entered adulthood, Eric carried that story like a scar. Michael knew this, and he carried his own wound, the unbearable weight of knowing his son hated him for something he did not do. It was a pain deeper than any prison sentence. For over a decade, Michael Morton remained in a cell while the world outside forgot him. The appeals failed. His son drifted further away. He was running out of options, running out of hope, and running out of years. But in 2005, something began to shift. A small team of attorneys from the Innocence Project would stumble across Michael's case. They would see something the courts ignored, unexamined DNA evidence. And that evidence would carry the power not just to free Michael Morton, but to expose the real killer. But that discovery wouldn't come easily, and the fight to uncover the truth would demand a war against prosecutors, judges, and a system determined to keep its secrets buried. Michael Morton's story was about to collide with forces bigger than himself. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, a flicker of hope would appear. The year was 1987. The Williamson County Courthouse loomed with its red brick walls and tall windows, a structure built to represent justice. But for Michael Morton, it would become a place of betrayal. The murder of Christine Morton had shaken the community. Neighbors whispered in grocery stores, newspapers fed headlines dripping with suspicion, and prosecutors fanned the flames. To them, the story was simple. A husband denied intimacy on his birthday. snapped in a fit of rage, and bludgeoned his wife to death. It was a story that sounded convenient, almost cinematic, except it wasn't true. But convenience often speaks louder than truth in a courtroom. District Attorney Ken Anderson, polished, composed, and deeply trusted in Williamson County, walked into the courtroom with one mission: to secure a conviction. He painted Michael as a man living a double life. To the jury, Anderson told a story of anger, lust, and selfishness. He held up Michael's birthday card, one Christine had written the day before she died. In it, she wrote a loving but weary note, apologizing for being tired, hinting that she couldn't always give him what he wanted. Anderson twisted this into motive, a rejection that allegedly pushed Michael over the edge. Michael sat silently at the defense table, his face pale, his heart pounding. How could a personal moment between him and his wife, scribbled in pen and meant only for his eyes, now be turned into a weapon against him? The jury listened closely. Some nodded, others avoided his gaze. Michael's defense attorney argued that there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No blood on his clothes, no fingerprints on the murder weapon, no history of violence. But the defense lacked something critical: access to suppressed evidence. They didn't know that the sheriff's department had in its possession a bloody bandana found in a field near the Morton home. They didn't know that Michael's 3-year-old son, Eric, had told his grandmother that Daddy wasn't there when Christine was hurt, that a monster man had come into the house instead. The jury never heard that. Instead, they were spoon-fed a narrative designed to convict, carefully curated to exclude anything that might sow doubt. Day after day, testimony piled up. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments. Investigators described what they believed to be a staged burglary. The prosecution leaned on Christine's diary, her private thoughts now twisted into evidence of marital strain. They implied Michael had become distant, detached, capable of violence hidden behind a mask of suburban normalcy. Michael's family sat in the courtroom, stunned. His father gripped the wooden pews so tightly his knuckles whitened. His mother whispered prayers under her breath. And Eric, just 3 years old, was kept far from the courtroom, his voice silenced. When Michael testified, his voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "I loved my wife," he said, steady but wounded. "I didn't kill Christine. I would never hurt her." But the prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. They painted him as cold, unfeeling, obsessed with sex. They mocked his demeanor, suggesting that his calmness was proof of guilt rather than shock. Michael looked toward the jury, desperate to connect, desperate for someone, anyone, to see his humanity. But the jury's eyes remained hard, skeptical. On a gray February afternoon in 1987, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Michael's heart raced as he looked at their faces, searching for hope. The foreman stood. The courtroom hushed. "Guilty," the words shattered through the air like glass. Michael's knees buckled, but he forced himself to remain upright. His family gasped. His father buried his face in his hands. Michael looked at the judge as if waiting for someone, anyone, to intervene, to stop the madness. But the gavel fell. Life in prison. Michael Morton had just been condemned for a crime he did not commit. Prison became his new reality. The walls closed in. The bars clanged shut. Inside, Michael was stripped of his identity. No longer a husband, no longer a father, no longer Michael Morton the man. He became just another inmate, a number in the system. But outside those prison walls, the real killer remained free. Free to move, free to breathe, free to hunt again. And he did. Just a year later, another woman, Deborah Baker, was found murdered in eerily similar circumstances, bludgeoned to death in her own bed. A crime that bore the same signature as Christine's. Had the jury known the truth, had the evidence been revealed, Deborah Baker might still be alive. But Michael Morton was paying the price instead. As Michael sat in his cell that first night, staring at the concrete walls, his mind echoed with a single question. How could this happen? But what he didn't know then was that his journey was far from over. Because buried in boxes of evidence, hidden in sheriff's files, and whispered in the words of his own son, lay the truth, waiting to be uncovered. And when it finally surfaced, decades later, it would not only change Michael's life, but expose one of the darkest betrayals of justice in Texas history. But for now, Michael Morton was just beginning his long descent into the abyss. And the truth, the real truth, was still locked away, waiting like a storm on the horizon. The steel door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed like the ceiling of a tomb. For Michael Morton, that sound wasn't just the end of a day, it was the start of a new life. A life he hadn't chosen, inside concrete walls he had never imagined, serving a sentence for a crime he hadn't committed. On paper, he was Offender Morton, Michael, number 734634, Texas Department of Criminal Justice. But to Michael, he was still a husband without a wife, a father without a child, a man without a future. This is the story of how he endured, how he survived the crushing weight of decades in prison, and how, in the most unlikely places, he found fragments of hope. When Michael first entered the Texas prison system, he was 32 years old, strong, healthy, with the physique of a man who had worked construction jobs and lived a middle-class suburban life. But prison was a world designed to break men like him. The noise was constant, metal clanging, voices shouting, guards barking orders. His senses were assaulted with the smell of sweat, bleach, and something rotten he couldn't quite name. His first cellmate was an older man named Daryl, a wiry lifer who had already spent 2 decades behind bars. Daryl sized Michael up with narrow eyes. "You don't look like you belong here," Daryl muttered. Michael, tired and raw from weeks of court, simply answered, "I don't." Daryl gave him a bitter laugh. "None of us do, man. You'll learn." The first months were brutal. Every day Michael thought of Christine, his wife, and their son Eric. He replayed that morning in August 1986 endlessly. Leaving for work, coming home to flashing police lights, the nightmare that unfolded. In prison, time did not move forward. It hung in the air like humidity, thick and unrelenting. Days bled into each other, marked only by the buzz of the morning count, the scraping of trays in the mess hall, and the lock-in at night. Michael kept a small calendar in his cell. At first, he marked every day, as though crossing them out might move him closer to freedom. But soon the pages became painful reminders of time lost. Eventually, he stopped. The cruelest part of Michael's sentence was not the bars or the guards. It was the distance between him and his son. Eric had been just 3 years old when Christine was killed. When Michael was convicted, custody of Eric was given to Christine's family. At first, Michael wrote letters, page after page of love, advice, small drawings in the margins. Sometimes they were sent back unopened. Sometimes he never knew if Eric had even seen them. "Dear Eric," he wrote once, "I love you more than you will ever understand. Someday, when you're ready, I'll tell you everything. But for now, just know, I think about you every single day." But letters were no substitute for being a father. Michael knew, deep down, that the boy he had once carried on his shoulders was growing up without him. Prison life required strategy. Daryl, his first cellmate, taught him quickly. "Rule 1, Daryl said, mind your own business. Rule 2, don't owe nobody nothing. And Rule 3, keep your head down. Don't try to be a hero. Heroes bleed." Michael followed the rules, but prison tested him constantly. Once, another inmate tried to pick a fight in the chow hall, bumping Michael's tray onto the floor. Michael froze, unsure. But before he could react, another man stepped between them. "You leave this one alone," the man said. "He ain't your target." Michael learned later that the man was called Sanchez, a Mexican-American inmate who had his own reputation for violence. Sanchez didn't owe Michael anything. But sometimes, in prison, mercy came in strange forms. Michael wasn't always a religious man, but in prison, he found himself drawn to the small chapel. The chaplain, An old man with a gentle voice offered him a Bible. At first, Michael resisted. His heart was full of rage. Rage at the prosecutors who had hidden evidence, at the jury that hadn't believed him, at the world that had taken his wife and child. But night after night, as the noise of prison life rattled the walls, he began reading. Slowly, words became lifelines. Psalms of sorrow, verses about endurance. In one letter, he wrote to Eric, "Your mom believed in kindness. I'm trying to hold on to that, even in here." Faith did not erase his pain, but it gave him something to hold in the silence. Michael became a student of the world outside. He devoured books, history, philosophy, even science fiction. Reading became a way to travel without leaving his cell. He subscribed to magazines. Sometimes he'd see an ad for children's toys or school supplies, and he'd pause, wondering what Eric was into at that age. Baseball, video games, music? He didn't know. Years passed. Guards changed. Inmates came and went. But books and letters were constants. There were dark moments. One winter night, Michael sat on the edge of his bunk and thought of Christine. He thought of the trial, the smug look on the prosecutor's face, the way the jury avoided his eyes when the verdict was read. He thought of Eric, growing up believing his father had killed his mother. The weight was unbearable. He pressed his fists into his temples, trying to block it out. "What's the point?" he whispered. But somehow, each time he reached the edge, something pulled him back. Sometimes it was faith. Sometimes it was sheer stubbornness. Sometimes it was the thought that one day, Eric might ask questions, and Michael needed to be alive to answer them. By the 1990s, Michael had become a fixture in the prison. The guards knew him. Other inmates respected him for keeping his head down. He worked in the prison library, stacking books, checking out magazines. Outside, the world was changing. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Cell phones were becoming common. Presidents came and went. But inside, Michael's world stayed the same. He marked the passage of years by small things. The death of a fellow inmate, the retirement of a guard, the fading of his own youthful face in the small scratched mirror above his sink. In 2005, nearly 20 years into his sentence, a small team of lawyers from the Innocence Project began looking into Michael's case. They suspected there might be DNA evidence from the crime scene, evidence never tested in the 1980s, evidence that might prove Michael's innocence. For Michael, it was a fragile ray of light. He had learned not to trust hope too much. Hope could break a man. But still, he prayed. Years passed as lawyers fought through layers of resistance. Prosecutors refused to release evidence. Judges stalled. Paperwork vanished. Michael waited year after year. Inside, Michael built unlikely friendships. Men who, like him, lived in limbo. There was Sanchez, who once protected him. There was James, a quiet man who taught Michael how to draw. There was Daryl, his first cellmate, who eventually died of cancer behind bars. Each friendship reminded Michael of his humanity. Each loss reminded him of the fragility of life. By now, Eric was an adult. He had grown up without his father, believing him guilty. Michael longed to explain, to tell his son everything. But Eric wanted nothing to do with him. In one of his lowest points, Michael admitted in a journal, "I have already lost him. Even if I walk free, he will never see me as his father. And that is a punishment worse than these walls." By the late 2000s, whispers of new evidence began to surface. The Innocence Project was closer than ever to proving what Michael had always known, that he was innocent. But the system fought back. Prosecutors dragged their feet. Judges denied motions. Each denial felt like another shovelful of dirt on his coffin. Still, Michael endured. He told himself that every day survived was one day closer to the truth. In August 2011, 25 years after Christine's murder, DNA testing finally revealed something shocking. The bandana, found near the Morton home all those years ago, carried blood and DNA. It wasn't Michael's. It belonged to another man. And not just any man, someone with a violent history. Someone who, while Michael rotted in prison, had been free and killing again. Michael didn't know it yet, but the fight for his freedom was about to explode into the public eye. What happens when the truth finally surfaces after decades of lies? What happens when justice can no longer ignore the evidence? That is where the story turns. Michael Morton had lived in the shadows for nearly 25 years. He had entered prison as a young man, falsely branded a murderer, stripped of his family, and buried under a mountain of lies. Now, in 2011, he was stepping out into a world that had moved on without him. But what happens to a man who has been silenced for decades? What does freedom really mean when time, something you can never get back, has been stolen? This is the story of Michael Morton's exoneration, his fight for healing, and the legacy he left behind. It was October 4th, 2011. The courthouse in Georgetown, Texas, buzzed with journalists, cameras, and members of the Innocence Project. Inside, Michael Morton sat quietly, dressed in a suit that felt strange on his shoulders after years in prison-issued uniforms. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom. DNA evidence had proven conclusively what Michael had said all along. He did not kill his wife, Christine. The true culprit, Mark Allen Norwood, had been linked to the crime through DNA found on Christine's bloody bandana. When the ruling came, Michael's hands trembled. The judge declared him exonerated, his conviction overturned. The words didn't just echo through the courtroom. They shattered the chains that had bound him for a quarter of a century. Michael closed his eyes, tears welling. This was not just freedom. This was vindication. But as he walked out into the sunlight, blinking against its warmth, the moment was bittersweet. His wife was still gone. His son, raised by others, was grown and a stranger to him. The years had vanished. Freedom was real, but so was loss. When Michael first embraced the outside world, he was a man both new and old. At 57, he was free, but his heart carried scars that no judge could erase. One of his greatest fears was facing his son, Eric. Michael had last seen him when the boy was just 3 years old, standing on the other side of a prison glass. Now, Eric was a grown man in his late 20s, shaped by years of believing his father had killed his mother. Would Eric forgive him? Would he even want to see him? Their reunion was quiet, private, and tense. Michael remembered the moment vividly. Eric entered the room cautiously, his eyes wary, carrying decades of pain and confusion. Michael stood frozen, desperate to hug him, but afraid to push too soon. Finally, Eric said softly, "I don't know you, but I know you didn't do it." Tears streamed down Michael's face. He reached out, and this time, his son didn't pull away. That first embrace was fragile, but it was a beginning. For years, Williamson County prosecutors had hidden evidence that pointed away from Michael. Among that evidence was a bloody bandana found near the crime scene. When the Innocence Project forced DNA testing, the results were chilling. The bandana carried Christine's blood and the DNA of a man named Mark Allen Norwood. Norwood was not a stranger to crime. He had a long history of burglary and violence. And just 2 years after Christine's murder, he killed again. In 1988, Norwood brutally murdered another woman, Deborah Baker, in Austin, Texas. Michael's wrongful conviction had not just destroyed his own life. It had allowed a killer to remain free, striking again while an innocent man wasted away in prison. In 2013, Norwood was convicted of Christine's murder. Later, he was also convicted for Deborah Baker's murder. He is now serving a life sentence. Justice had finally found him, but far too late. Michael Morton could have left the nightmare behind and quietly disappeared into his new life. But he refused. For him, freedom was not enough. There had to be accountability. The prosecutors who had hidden evidence, ignored leads, and buried the truth had stolen 25 years of his life. Chief among them was Ken Anderson, the district attorney who had pursued Michael relentlessly, all while sitting on evidence that could have cleared him. Michael wanted justice, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. If this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. The fight was long and bitter, but eventually, Ken Anderson faced the consequences. In 2013, Anderson was found guilty of contempt of court and evidence tampering. He was sentenced to 10 days in jail, fined, and stripped of his law license. 10 days in jail. That was all he served, compared to Michael's 25 years. Michael's response was telling. He wasn't satisfied with the punishment, but he wasn't bitter either. He simply said, "At least there's a record. At least the world knows what he did." Prison had hardened Michael in some ways, but it had also deepened him. He had found solace and faith during the darkest years, writing journals, reading scripture, and searching for meaning. In freedom, he leaned on that faith as he tried to rebuild. He began writing his memoir, Getting Life, in which he shared the harrowing story of his wrongful conviction, his years behind bars, and the journey to exoneration. The book was not just a testimony, it was a lifeline. Through its pages, Michael reached others who had suffered, giving them hope that even in the darkest cell, light could eventually find its way in. He also became a public speaker, advocating for criminal justice reform. His voice carried weight, not because of anger, but because of lived truth. He urged lawmakers to adopt safeguards, open file discovery, DNA testing access, and accountability for prosecutors who abused their power. Life had taken Christine from him, and for years Michael thought he'd never know love again. But fate had another chapter for him. In 2013, Michael married Cynthia, a woman who had read his story and reached out during his fight for freedom. Their connection grew into something profound, a reminder that even after decades of pain, love could bloom again. The wedding was small and intimate, a celebration not just of love, but of survival. Michael often said that finding Cynthia was proof that his story wasn't only about loss, it was also about restoration. Michael's story sparked a wave of change across Texas and beyond. His case was a driving force behind the Michael Morton Act, passed in 2013. The act required prosecutors in Texas to share all evidence with the defense, ending the era of hidden files and secret trials. It was a law written in the blood of injustice, a safeguard to protect others from suffering the way Michael had. Michael often said, "If my story keeps just one person from going through what I did, then maybe all those years weren't wasted." By the late 2010s, Michael had rebuilt a quiet life. He lived with Cynthia, stayed close with Eric, and continued speaking publicly. But the scars never disappeared. Nights in prison haunted him. Memories of Christine's laughter, silenced too soon, lingered painfully. And yet, Michael chose not to be defined by bitterness. "You can't get back what was stolen," he once said, "but you can decide what to do with what's left." His story became one of resilience, of justice long delayed but finally delivered. It was a reminder that truth has a way of breaking through, even after decades in the dark. As Michael looked back on his 25 years in prison, he often wondered how many others were still trapped, still silenced, still waiting for someone to believe them. For every Michael Morton who finally walked free, how many more were still lost in the shadows of wrongful conviction? And the question that lingers for us all is this: how many innocent people remain behind bars, waiting for the day the truth will finally set them free? Michael Morton's story is more than just a tragic miscarriage of justice. It's a reminder of how fragile freedom can be and how dangerous it is when truth is ignored. For nearly 25 years, an innocent man lost his family, his future, and his name, all while the real killer remained free. But through perseverance, relentless advocacy, and the power of truth, Michael's nightmare finally came to an end. His exoneration didn't just restore his freedom, it shined a light on the urgent need for reform so that no one else suffers the same fate. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Join us on this journey as we uncover more wrongful convictions, hidden truths, and the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. This is Innocence Uncovered. Before you go, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next case we bring to light. Together, we can give a voice to the voiceless and bring attention to the stories that demand justice. Thank you for watching. And remember, every story matters, especially the ones the world tried to forget.